The Quick Selection tool is a unique and powerful selection tool in Photoshop. In essence, with this tool you are demonstrating to Photoshop the tone, color, and texture of the object you wish to select, and Photoshop does its best to identify the edges of that object. As you'll see in this lesson, quite often the Quick Selection tool does a remarkable job at the assigned task. Before I show you the use of the Quick Selection tool, I want to give you something to compare it to, and that is the Magic Wand tool. So I'm going to click and hold my mouse on the button for the Quick Selection tool in order to bring up the flyout menu, and then I'll choose Magic Wand tool from that menu. Now I'll click on the Buddha statue that I'd like to select here, and as you can see, I am far from a good selection. I can shift-click on additional areas in order to enhance the selection, but as you can see, I'm getting lots of the background area included in this selection. I'll go ahead and deselect that selection, and then we'll switch to the Quick Selection tool to see how it's able to do a much better job under these circumstances. Let's first take a look at the options bar for the Quick Selection tool. We have the same basic options for adding and subtracting, but we don't have the option to intersect with a selection. So the options here are simply to create a new selection, to add to the existing selection, or to subtract from the existing selection. In most cases, I utilize the New Selection option. This way, whenever I create a new selection, it will replace an existing selection. If I want to add or subtract, I'll use the keyboard shortcut keys, Shift key to add, and on Windows the Alt key or Macintosh the Option key to subtract. In the case of the Quick Selection tool, if I use the Create New Selection option and then create an initial selection, it will automatically switch to the Add to Selection option. When I'm working with the Add to Selection option, I can still create a new selection. In other words, if there's no selection active and I'm working with the Add to Selection option, clicking and dragging will simply start creating a new selection. I can then continue adding to that selection. There's also a brush pop-up which allows us to change the size and hardness of the brush that we're using to paint with the Quick Selection tool. The size will adjust on the fly as we're working in the image, but the hardness I always set to 100%. This presents more complete information to Photoshop as it's analyzing the image, but more importantly, it makes it easier to paint up against the edge of an object as needed without having a feathered edge of the brush going outside that object. I generally work with the Sample All Layers option turned on so that the image is being analyzed based on its actual appearance. In some cases, this could be problematic. For example, if I were working on a composite image that contained multiple image layers and I only want to create a selection of a portion of one of those image layers, in that type of situation, I would want to turn Sample All Layers off and then make sure that I select the appropriate layer that I want the Quick Selection tool to analyze while I'm painting. We also have an Auto Enhance option, which is unique to the Quick Selection tool. In most cases, I leave this option turned on. It will cause Photoshop to do some additional processing after we've created our basic selection in order to refine the edge just a little bit. You'll sometimes notice this behavior as a selection edge that bounces around slightly after you've drawn it until it finally settles on what it believes to be the edge of the object you're trying to select. If you find that adjustment is causing problems, you could certainly turn Auto Enhance off, but in my experience, leaving it on all the time is the best approach. With the Quick Selection tool configured, all I need to do is paint to define the object that I want to select. In this case, I actually want to select the statue, so I'll click and drag to start creating a selection. Notice that as I start dragging, the selection expands to include additional parts of this statue. Photoshop is analyzing the texture of the areas that I painted and looking for similar areas, and more importantly, looking for the edges of those areas so that it can define the selection. I can continue painting to expand this selection to other areas of the statue. And as I sample additional areas, you'll see that from time to time, the selection will jump around. In other words, I don't need to trace very carefully. I simply paint over a few areas of the statue, and it's able to identify the overall statue for me and create a reasonably accurate selection. And in this case, I'll zoom in a bit, you can see that overall we have a very nice selection. The only problem I see is in this small area where the head of the statue meets the shoulder. To fix that, all I need to do is subtract from selection, so I'll press the left square bracket in this case to reduce my brush size. I could also increase it with the right square bracket, and then I'll hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and paint into this area. Initially, you'll notice that that base selection is not entirely accurate, but when I release the mouse, Photoshop will process a little bit and we'll get a much more accurate result. So with just a couple of fine painting adjustments, I'm able to clean up this selection. As you can certainly appreciate based on what you saw just a few moments ago, this is a much more powerful tool in many cases than the Magic Wand tool. The only advantage of the Magic Wand tool in certain situations is that the Magic Wand tool includes the ability to create discontiguous selections. In other words, I can create a selection that includes multiple areas of the image that are not contiguous with each other. That ability to create discontiguous selections can be very helpful. For example, if you have an image where a tree goes up into the sky, you might have bits of sky that are in between various branches of the tree. But in a case where you only need to create a contiguous selection, or where there are several discontiguous areas that you can add to the selection relatively easily, the Quick Selection tool is hard to beat. When it comes to the actual selection tools in Photoshop, there's no question in my mind that the Quick Selection tool is the most powerful. That doesn't mean it's the only selection tool you'll put to use, but it does mean you'll likely put it to use more often than the other selection tools at your disposal.